let me tell you a little bit about my friend John Snyder. I've known him for many years now, and I got to tell you, I consider him one of the most knowledgeable people in the hobby. His encyclopedic knowledge of the history of comics and collectibles is truly astounding. His collection, which I had the privilege of viewing several years back, was mind-blowing, just unbelievable collection. It spans so many different types of collectibles, so many different categories, and what was even more impressive was that every piece was a museum-quality, high-grade example of the piece. And I didn't even realize that until I had finished with looking around this like a John Snyder's museum. And afterwards he said, "Did you notice?" I said, "No. What are you talking about?" I was like, "Did you notice the condition of everything?" And he's like, "Yeah, you're right. Everything was literally in perfect shape or close to it." John, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. You were one of my first guests about 4 years ago. It's hard to believe it's literally December, and it's 4 years since I started the show. Thank you so much for joining me again.
Thank you.
So, John, let's talk a little bit about your collection itself. How would you describe it to someone who hasn't seen it? Well, I obviously told a little bit about it, but what would you say about your collection? What was your purpose in putting it together?
Well, I think over the years it's sort of evolved as I've learned more and more things. But I've always been fascinated with the marketing side and the advertising elements that go into the promotion of all these different characters, and as well as the history of the media, and how it impacted all of these activities during my lifetime as well as others. And as I, really look at it, it's like anything related to television or related to music or related to radio, the movies, almost any of those kind of things. If it was radio, the radio shows, The Shadow, The Green Hornet, and books in general. So almost all of these different things, as I kind of learned a little bit about the history of it, different things would intrigue me and how it was promoted and so forth.
That's great. And do you know approximately how many pieces you have in your overall collection? Thousands?
It's probably 40,000, yeah.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Do you have a piece that is your most prized possession, your as they put it, your holy grail of your collection?
Not really.
No,
I'm impressed really with a lot of new stuff as well as the old stuff. I mean, some of the wonderful things they're creating today is even more spectacular in some ways because they are continually learning from the past and learning how to do it better. And of course, some of the wonderful figures that are produced today are they're almost hard to believe that they're not real when you look at them. I mean, if you see the Fantastic Four, for instance, and you see all these wonderful figures of the Human Torch and Invisible Girl and so forth, you just can't believe that that they can make those things. They look so lifelike.
It is. I think back at the toys I played with in the 70s, and I was thrilled to have those. I mean, that was some Megos and the Planet of the
Correct.
Apes, the Star Trek, the superhero Megos, and then the Star Wars figures. And to me, that was
That's
the greatest thing in the world. And now look at what they're doing today. It is really impressive.
Yes, it really is. Yeah, the role, for the most point, the role of toys have always been literally to educate children, and the other side of it is to keep their minds occupied. And so in that process, it's not an easy task, especially today, to impress a child. They've seen so many different things that you have to keep raising the bar in all these efforts that you make to create new toys and to promote those toys, to get kids interested in them. So you're really seeing some wonderful things come out today, and there's some, and it's great to go back through the history and study how we've evolved into where we are today too.
Yeah. Give me an example of something you look at and that shows you the true evolution of the toy. And when you speak about a toy, you're not just talking about an action figure. You're talking about in the broader scope of things. You're talking about Go ahead.
Yeah, like for instance, a character watch is a good example. You can go back to the early 1900s, and as you watch the watches evolve, it's not only the watch itself that changes, but it's also the packaging And it's very intriguing to see as you go through the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, the 50s, right on up to the present, this incredible advertising and the packaging. So you'll see these wonderful graphics in the boxes. You'll see the inserts, just dramatic art that's put on them. There'll be little giveaways. Sometimes it was a pin or a ring that went along to promote the watch. And now it's evolved into, a digital, or still have the same kind of watches as they used to have, which has characters on them. So to collect watches as one category, as an example, you can see how that evolves. And of course, they have little toy watches, which didn't work, which kids wore at the very beginning, and then eventually they would wear that watch. But the concept was to get the kids to learn how to tell time. And the idea behind that was once you did that, you could create an order in their life. They'd know when to eat. They'd know when to go to school. They'd know when to get up. So it all had some purpose, and the kids, of course, loved them. And the more ornate little pictures that were on there, or the more characters that were on there, the more interesting they got. But at the same time, I was teaching them to tell time.
Do you remember as a child one of your first toys, comics, action figures, watches, or premiums? Do you remember what it was, that first thing that just ignited your...
I was born during the war, and during World War II. And a lot of kids back then, very few of the parents had money, and most of the fathers, the brothers of the fathers and uncles, all that kind of stuff, they were off the war. So in a lot of cases, the gifts that you got were where you got the toys, and usually it was a birthday or Christmas. And comics really prevailed well back then as gifts because they were very inexpensive and everybody could afford them to some degree. They were 10 cents. So as you got into the regular toy, like if it was a cap pistol or a wind-up toy or tin toy or just a little figure or something like that on a set of Army men, whatever it was a little more expensive. So you didn't see that kind of thing until after the war.
Right.
You were born during the war. But like most children, I got my toys as gifts, and so I remember vividly having a lot of toys related to things that were done, by the adults, like a toy car or a little toy house, or the Army men. Of course, all the kids played with during the war because that was what was going on. It was on the news all the time, and you were listening to it. So and then things related to movies that would come out are. You got to remember, Disney was heavily promoting the toys and so forth during the early cartoons, and during the Depression, and so there was an attitude of when a new movie would come out or when a new cartoon would come out, there would be these toys coming out. And of course, one of the greatest all-time promoters was Kay Kamen, who worked for Disney, who really, put Disney on the map in terms of merchandising. So there was wonderful toys, all through my lifetime, particularly in the early period.
Now, I know that through your involvement with Diamond Distribution and galleries, Diamond has moved into producing some great toys also, statues and sculptures and busts. Did you have anything to do with that movement, that repositioning of the company?
No, not really. I was involved in. It was pretty much Steve Geppe's idea from day one. And when I started working with Diamond in '93, we had a contract with Randy Bowen right off the bat to produce a couple of figurines. And then eventually he went out on his own, and Diamond eventually came in and started doing their own thing. But for the most part, I would say Steve Geppe was probably the paramount reason that Diamond got into the collectible field of producing those figurines and so forth.
Great stuff. I definitely enjoy them. I collect a few myself.
Yeah. Can't go wrong.
It's hard to resist. They're really beautiful pieces of art, and they're not that many made. Some of the production runs are 3,000, 5,000 pieces. That's not a lot.
No, it's not, and there's so many different ones. They've really now. A lot of people thought it would kill the market by producing so many, but actually it's gone just the reverse. It's created more variety and more variations in sizes and shapes and composition, and as a result of that, people are collecting them all by themselves. So,
yeah.
And I don't see that really going away.
No,
you got to remember they've been doing that for a long time. I mean,
yes.
there was figurines go back in the 1890s, so with the Brownies and Yellow Kid and so forth. But it's just a wonderful group of things that have been produced over the last 15 years.
Yeah, no, I really do enjoy them. Look at my office. I've decorated with a lot of the busts and the statues, and the images are just spectacular. They really are. And I even have an old 1950s one of those I guess they call it like a friction toy, the wind up. It's like a little monkey on a tin toy, a motor operated. Great stuff, and just fun stuff. And you see stuff like this, and it kind of harkens back to a simpler time, a time in your life where I think things were easier. Everybody's childhood is usually, if you think back, the happiest times of their life.
Right. Well, not only that, but what's happened today with all the news and all the books that have been produced, people have access to more information, and consequently, as a result of that, they're able to interpret how far back this goes, as well as how many different categories of things were accomplished. And as a result of that, they are collecting from an historical standpoint as well. So where you've had, particularly in the 60s and the 70s and even the 80s, you had a lot of emotion related to childhood and people collecting sort of as a beginning step. And what's happened in the 90s and into the 2000s, that people have gone beyond that into more of a professional collector, and they're really going from an historical standpoint as well. So there's a combination of that emotion plus wanting to know where these characters came from and what kind of things were made. And the next thing you know, they're hooked on that too. So it's a great time to be a collector, because the access to information and the amount of time these things have been produced, you literally can walk into like almost a time machine, and you can go through these periods, these decades, and really like be a kid by owning some of these things and understanding what children were like in the 1910s and 1920s, 1930s. As you own this merchandise that was created during that era.
Yeah, you're
you have to remember
right.
too. You have to remember too, Benny. The whole thing is driven by art. That no matter what it is, whether it's a figurine or it's a wind-up toy or it's a watch, there was art that was drawn that got you to the stage of the prototype stage of developing these products. And so the art is really dominating. It's eye-catching. And it's drawing you to these things. And so when you look at as an example, if you looked at the Buck Rogers campaign in the 30s, and you look at all the ads and all the wonderful things, and you look at the Art Deco that's on these boxes, and it's on these wind-up toys and on the comics, and it's just phenomenal art. And so when you start going back and you find out who these people were, and you see how incredible they were and how much they were getting paid. I mean, a lot of these people in the 20s were making six figures, and in the 30s, where a lot of people were, destitute and 5 million people out of a job, a lot of these artists are still making six figures. So it blows you away to see how good they really were, and that's one of the reasons they were in our hobby, because it was paying so much money. Particularly the artists that drew for the newspapers.
Yeah, that's really all. It all seems to really tie together when you look at the big picture.
It does.
And one of the great places people can go to see how it all ties together is the Jeppe Entertainment Museum, which you helped to create, and that's in Baltimore, Maryland, right next to Camden Yards, a beautiful baseball stadium. And I had the pleasure of going to the museum when it first opened. I was really thrilled to be invited and to see everything. It was overwhelming and just awe-inspiring. It was really a great experience, and you played a really pivotal role in getting this thing rolling. I know Steve was Steve Jeppe was behind it, but tell me a little bit about how it evolved and how it came to be.
Well, I met Steve Jeppe on July 14th, 1974. And it sounds ridiculous to say this, but I think we became best friends from the day we met. And he was obsessed with this whole mentality of getting collectors together and getting them all to interact, and he liked the idea of buying their comics and storing their comics and selling their comics. I mean, he was the entrepreneur deluxe, but he was in the basement of a TV repair shop when I first met him, and he had some glorious ideas. He was in his early 20s. I was a little older than him, and I was already, had a lot of success in the field I was in, and I was really intrigued by his ideas and his openness, and he's a guy's a genius as a promoter and a finance guy. I mean, there's nobody could figure out money better than he can. But he always wanted to have a museum. He kept talking about it. I don't think there was a year that went by from the day I met him that he didn't mention something about it. And he would always say to me there would be a time to do it. And I know when some of the other museums started up and he wanted to get involved in them, and he was always trying to promote them and help them in any way, shape, or form. And finally, when the time came, he seized the opportunity. You could not find a better place than where that museum is located, as well as the museum itself. I mean, the setting is historic. It's the old train station that Babe Ruth went through, Abraham Lincoln went through there on his way to his first inauguration, and also to give the Gettysburg Address.
Yeah, that's a relative of yours, from what
That's correct.
Yeah,
that's
your cousins. How many times removed? But cousins of Abraham.
Fourth removed. Yeah.
Wow, it's pretty amazing. That's interesting.
Yeah, actually, that's a whole other subject.
We're going to talk about that a little later. I just wanted to mention
okay.
that you brought him up. But that's great. So let's talk a little bit more about the.
Yeah, Steve is really the motivator behind the museum, and I think what happened is when he first started talking about it, was going to be a comic book museum, and I think that's what he always kind of envisioned. But as this, all this information started to unfold and books started to get generated, of which again he was had a lot to do with it because he was the one that was, paying for these books to be developed. And as we started hiring some of these very prominent people like Bob Overstreet and Ted Hake and Russ Cochran and people like that, it sort of like kind of dovetailed the whole thing together. And as the books started being put together and as we started gaining more information and understanding this whole element of distribution, because that has such an important ingredient to the history of all this. And then all of a sudden this opportunity came where they were going to rent out this museum. They had totally renovated this building, this old train station. And that kind of set the stage for us to make the move to go into it. And so you got to remember, the building is owned by the state. And to get that building is a coup in itself. So it's just not something that anybody could have walked down and just say, I want to rent this building. So to get the building and to get it in that beautiful area, which is completely redecorated and revamped, and they have the Ravens Stadium and they have the Orioles Stadium, and then of course the museum. It's just a perfect place, to get people to come in. So the timing was perfect because we had spent so many years studying this industry and how it evolved with all these different categories, and we were really ready to put this all together in this museum. And the most important thing, and a lot of people don't know this story, but the most important thing of all, is Steve was very fortunate over the last 6-7 years. Some very major collections came out, and as a result of that, Steve was able to buy a number of artifacts that he had not, that he didn't have, and that we desperately needed to fill in the blanks for some of these rooms. And so the timing of the building, the timing of the material showing up, all the accumulation of material that he'd been acquiring since '74, it all kind of came to a head. And of course, to finance it all and to buy the cases and the millions of dollars it cost just to set the whole thing up and hire, contractors that understood the engineering elements and to conform the building into a museum, because a lot of things had to be done for that to happen. So there were so many different elements involved. It wasn't just a matter of getting a building and putting a collection down there. It all had a life of its own.
Speaking of the collection, tell our listeners what type of items they could be able to see when they come to the museum.
The first thing you have to understand the museum in itself, the whole idea was to set up a time frame between 1776 and the present. When we opened up the gallery, it was roughly 230 years of history. And the key ingredient when you're trying to promote an attraction is to try to get as many people to come in, and of course our main audience was children. We wanted to educate the kids on the history of our country and how entertainment and all of this memorabilia played a role in that. And so in the process, when Steve kind of gave us the job of starting to get involved in this, and of course oversaw a lot of the movement, almost everything that happened there, whether it was the way the cases were made or what colors the rooms were or what kind of floor went in, and et cetera, we started looking at the space we had. We divided it up into 8 rooms. We actually have 2 museums within a museum because there is a story in 4 colors, we call it, which is a museum on the comic books from 1776 to the present. And then the other 7 rooms are everything together. The comics and all the other products, roughly 350 different products, are all mingled in there. One of the big promotion factors is we tried to tie it in with history. So when you come into each room in the museum, there will be information related to the presidents, related to important events, wars, depressions, anything that was going on, and you can see the direct correlation between the artifacts that were produced during that era and these world events. So when you're coming into the first room, which we call the Pioneer Spirit, which is 1776 to 1894, you'll see the presidents and the interaction of what happened in society reflected in a lot of that. So you'd see George Washington or Adams or Jefferson, some reference to them as you're going through these rooms and the art and a lot of the things that we have up there. So as you go into the second room, which is 1895 to 1927, you might see a toy of Ulysses Grant, who was 2-term president, or you might see something related to other social events that happened during that time. So you'd see the history of flight, or you'd see the history of the movies, or you'd see the history of the automobile being invented, or so forth. So as you move through there, we try to capture the essence of the timeline of the American icons, particularly these comic characters. So we take the centerpiece of each room is the character that's the most prominent in that era, and then built around that centerpiece are the toys that literally survived, and we have them on display in that room. So as you walk from room to room, you clearly see that the kids that are living in that era are reflecting on this merchandise, and a lot of these kids go into the next era and become the adults who actually manufacture, promote, design, write the stories, draw the art. And so you see a building process as you go through each individual room. You see characters that are copied, marketing plans that are copied, various different covers are similar from one era to the next. So Walt Disney, as you go into the 1928 to 1945 room, which Walt Disney dominated that era, when you look at Walt Disney and you look at all the memorabilia that he is producing that is on display there, you now can go back and see what Walt Disney was looking at as a kid prior to him becoming an adult, and you see very close comparisons in characters and themes and the way they talk and the types of things. So clearly the young kid who evolves into an artist or a writer is getting a lot of information as a kid and watching all this and taking it to another level. So what it shows you as you end up and finishing this tour as a collector, it shows you that these pieces that you have in a lot of cases are connected to other pieces, and certain characters are connected to other characters. And so when Stan Lee's a kid and he grows up and starts working for Timely, and then he goes from Timely and goes through this whole process, when he starts creating those characters for Marvel, you can see a direct influence, if you know the history of Timely, in what he's doing there. And he's taken it to another level. So that's the part that's fascinating, not only from going to the museum and looking at it, but every collector out that's listening to this should try to go to that museum, not only from a standpoint of being entertained, but to try to observe how this works so they can understand what they're collecting and what it means when they collect these things.
It is true. I would say that Baltimore has so many different things to offer, from the great restaurants to the stadiums for sporting events, the aquarium, and this museum. You could make a great weekend out of it with your family, and it's a wonderful idea. The harbor is beautiful. It's just a fun place. I definitely would recommend it.
Getting back to one point I wanted to make on the museum, when we structured the museum, we tied it into a social studies / historic event. So the kids, like it'd be a 3rd, 4th, 5th grade class, it would fit into the criteria for them to come visit and get credit for those history classes and social studies classes. So when you come into that room and you see who the presidents and the social connection, et cetera, the toys and the artifacts that are in there, the comic books and all that, they are really teaching those children about history. So it's kind of like comic books teaching people how to read. This museum teaches these kids about the history of our country.
And how often do you have school, classes in there?
They come in there every day. I mean, there's not a day that goes by that there aren't a group of kids in there. I have witnessed the excitement. I mean, I'll never forget this. Not too long ago, I was 3 or 4 kids, probably 7, 8, 9, and they were sitting there looking at a collection of pep pens. And, of course, these pep pens came out in the late 40s. And one kid says, I'm going to own all of these. And I looked at him and I said, but you don't even know who some of these characters are. He said, doesn't make any difference. I just like the way they look.
That's a great answer.
While when we were kids and we became adults and we collected, you have to remember a lot of this we did on our own initiative. But these kids are being motivated to collect. They're literally seeing things that we never got to see. We had to kind of find them to figure out what they were. They literally can go down and look at them and then say, I want to get that. So it's a whole different mentality today. And it's much better to promote this hobby with things like the museum to show kids what it's all about.
That's great. Now, let's change gears a little bit and talk about Diamond. Recently moved. What was behind the move from the Timonium, Maryland, to Pennsylvania?
Well, first off, there's so many things that are behind this, but probably the most predominant one is we just needed more space.
I see.
We were in an area which was pretty much tapped out, and we just couldn't move. And getting in the auction business, you need a tremendous amount of space to store things and to get particularly things that come in through the mail and so forth. You've got to have a very wide open area to protect and watch these things carefully from the consigners. So
now, we
needed a lot more space.
Was this basically you purchased both Hakes and Morphe's? Did you try first to move one of the companies into your offices in Timonium? Is that what it meant?
Yeah, we tried that, and it really didn't work well because you need a tremendous amount of space to work with, and people are constantly doing write-ups on articles and grading articles, and you can't, if you don't have a big space to move around in, you're going to bump into people and you can cause damage to articles. And so you have to be very careful. There's a flow to this thing that is almost like a science, and you need a lot of space. And of course, Steve's tremendous inventory just keeps getting bigger and bigger, so you got to find more space to put it.
Amazing. So you moved into a bigger facility in Pennsylvania. What part of Pennsylvania is that?
It's York, Pennsylvania. Okay. It's actually about 44 miles from our home office, so it's not that far away.
Okay, about an hour and 20 minutes, hour and 15 minutes to drive. That's great. And are you situated there now?
Yes, and we're in a one building, so we're not on a floor. We don't have other tenants, and we have the building all to ourselves. Another thing, too, it's much easier to get to. There's a tremendous amount of collectors in this corridor, this New York, Jersey, Pennsylvania corridor. It's just an amazing number of people that collect. So we're closer, I think, to more collectors as well, which makes it more convenient for people to come visit and talk to us and see things we have and talk about our books and give us advice on, how to degrade and the price and so forth.
Now, while Morphe's and Hakes were very well-run companies, how do you think the strategies have changed since Diamond has taken over the companies?
Well, everything Steve does, he takes it to another level. He's a big promoter. He's always willing to finance companies and take a loss to take them to another level. And his investment in both companies in terms of the Internet presence, in terms of the incredible increase in the look of our catalogs, the way we promote, the advertising budget, everything just totally changed in that relationship. And his bottom line has always been to help the hobby, to promote the hobby, to offer them better services. And so if Steve has to lose money to do that, he's done it. And you can tell that in the quality of the price guides when we bought the guides, how they've changed. And there's much more information, more page count, a bigger investment all the way around. So
he's in it for the long term.
Absolutely. I mean, when you look at Scoop, it promotes all the other auction houses, which is unheard of in the private sector. I mean, you don't see a car manufacturer promoting its rival on television.
True.
But Steve just sits there and he promotes everybody. So almost any auction house that's legitimate, that's in business, is promoted in Scoop. And he does it, as kind of a giving back to the industry for all the success that the people have given him.
For those of you who are listening who have never heard of Scoop, Scoop is a wonderful online newsletter that comes out every week. It really keeps everybody abreast of what's going on in terms of anything pop culture related, really, whether it be auctions or record-breaking sales or new movies, comic book related movies, and coin auctions, and it just really runs the gamut of collectibles. It encompasses so many different categories, and it's really wonderful. It's a great tool for people like myself, who I run, own Metropolis Collectibles and the Comic Zone radio show, to be able to promote it and get the word out there to as many people as possible. I'm sure on Scoop this week you'll see a blurb in there about John being on the show. So it is something I definitely would say you should go join today if you can. What's the website though to join? Scoop.diamond.com?
Yes,
Yeah.
In fact, if you listen to the ad that came on right before I started,
yeah,
gives you all the details.
There you go. Now, we've talked a lot about collectibles, and we've talked a lot about the different genres and different categories. What about the jobs related to the different collectibles?
Well, that's one thing that I'm so happy you've asked me, and it's something that's always irritated me. When I see interview after interview on TV and anyone that says anything negative about our hobby. Our hobby is made up of small businesses and people, that are trying their best to make a living. And it accomplishes so many things, and it continues to grow each year. When you sit down and look at the jobs that are created from this, some people just don't think about it. It's never discussed. But as an example, think of when you go into a shopping center, every shopping center has a frame shop. And how many people take their art in our business and get it framed? I mean, it's amazing. When you look at the auctions, you think of, the first thing you think of is the auction itself, but think behind the scenes of the appraisers, of the people that are doing all the write-ups, of the photographers. The tremendous amount of advertising that's going on. As you go over and look at a magazine or you look at a book, try to think of all these different printers, that are employed by printing these price guides, and think of all the people that are designers that are doing a lot of the graphics and so forth.
And if you think about all the people who have started businesses based on, using their computers to be online to sell through eBay, sell collectibles through eBay, and then all the people who work for UPS or FedEx who are now they're hiring more people to deliver more packages because commerce has increased so much because of collectibles. You're right.
Yeah.
You're right.
You got all the writers, you got all the artists. You and I would not be talking unless we had a job working in this industry.
It's true.
You know, and look, when you go down to the museum, it's wonderful just to look at that because the cabinets, you know, cost in the millions to put in there. And I looked at all the laborers down there that were hired, and I looked at all the designers and the engineers that were hired. And you think of all those cases that people have in their homes, how many of those are all there for one purpose, to showcase the collection. One thing people don't realize is how we affect the housing industry. I mean, if you go out into Hollywood and you look at all these massive homes, great majority of them have huge homes, huge rooms, you know, for their posters and their entertainment center and all their little cases from collectibles and so forth. I mean, it goes on. Look at the Mylar bags. Look at the incredible... look at the grading services. I mean, all those people would not be there if it wouldn't be, you know, for investors and so forth. It really goes on and on and on. Like you said, the shipping, the insurance, you know, all the things related to that. There's no end to it, really. And it does impact our economy in a big way. Probably the one that is the biggest secret of all, which no one ever talks about. And if you go to antique shows, you'll see it vividly. A lot of gray hair. You'll see a lot of elderly people cashing out their collections, are finding things in their attic and their basement, which actually saves their home, gives them some money to live on, to retire on, things of that nature. Mm-hmm. So this hobby has played very well for the older element in terms of selling things that they either collected as a child or they inherited from their parents. And all in all, it really is a very strong positive thing, too. It's not something that creates any problems on any level.
Well, those are great points that you're making, really are, and they're hardly ever talked about by right. people who discuss the impact of our hobby. I know I was recently on Fox Business, and they interviewed me about investing in comic books, and it was very interesting to hear the people who were opposing it at the end, guys who work on Wall Street, and as I was listening to them, it also, you know, just occurred to me, comic books and collectibles in general have such a proven track record and such consistent growth over time. When you compare that to stocks and bonds, well, maybe not bonds, but when you compare it to stocks, which it's almost like gambling. You don't know what's going on. I can learn more about Superman #1 in one day than I can learn about a major Fortune 500 company right. in one day. And one guy at that company can do one thing that could screw up the whole company and bring the stock price down, you know, 20 points the next day, and you're where are you then? Whereas collectibles are a lot more consistent, stable in terms of investments. Of course, I'm talking about ones that are older, not, you know, something you buy. Yeah, there's
a good reason for that, and I've talked about this, you know, with a lot of collectors before. I never had a chance to say this on a show or anything, but part of the problem is our educational system. A lot of these people are brought up in a system where they get a degree in finance or they learn about stocks, bonds, real estate, commodities. And the traditional investment areas are kind of in our institutions in terms of how people are trained. Where they run into a major problem is they are all trying to promote themselves as a professional to the constituency that they represent. And they just aren't familiar with this field. So what happens is, anytime you ever hear any of them talk about it, they try to change the subject real quick because they aren't an expert. They cannot really talk on it. So as a result of that, they look kind of dumb. and so our institutions now are starting to look at this with a lot more interest. And you're starting to see some courses you know, on the history of this, and you're starting to see people starting to understand that. And with more and more positive mention from the media each year, you know, this whole thing is becoming more mainstream, and it's commanding a lot of greater respect than it ever has. So as a result of that, I think with time, these people may see that there's a necessity to get into this field of investing and might hire somebody like a Vinny or whoever to come in and show them what's going on. I think the biggest problem they have is lack of information, and they don't want to look stupid, so they have to say something negative about it, because if they don't, they're just not going to look good to the general audience.
That makes sense to me. Let's talk, John, let's talk a little bit about You know, now it's very interesting. The more I've gotten to know you and learn about you, a lot of your life you spent in public service, and it seems that public service runs in your family's blood. Tell us a little about that.
Boy, it'd take another hour to even come close to it, but I guess in a summary, you're right about running in the blood. We have a history going clear back to when our family first came into Pennsylvania in 1744, my ancestors, and almost throughout that whole period up to the present, the men and the women have been involved in doing special things related to serving, whether it's in politics or religion. There seems to be evidence all the way through that we've had a number of prominent people in our family that has done a number of things to help society, to do everything they can to promote and helping people in general. So it's been sort of exciting to have a background of some prominent people, and it's kind of made me want to live up to the standard of what some of these people have done. So I've tried my very best, and I got, as a result of that, I got started very young in understanding the political world and how our society worked, and et cetera. I remember vividly in 1956, which I'm sure you weren't born by then, but I remember vividly watching the Democrat National Convention when Esther Kefauver beat John Kennedy, who was a candidate for vice president at the time, I think, and it was 5 or 6 ballots. And it was so exciting to watch the process and how it worked, and to see this young guy, John Kennedy, getting interested in politics. I think he was in his late 30s at the time, and in running for vice president, so a young person could really become, elected in a major role like that. So it was sort of encouraging. And then as you watched the country change, and as you watched how the opportunities, were opened up for a lot of people during the 60s and 70s that were young. So, and it's no different today. The only difference today is it takes so much money to run for a political office that they've cut an awful lot of people out. And I don't personally like that. But I had a really wonderful run there as a young person, to be involved in a lot of political campaigns and to meet a lot of important people. And I learned a lot from that.
Now, when you look back on your life in politics and public service, did you ever meet other politicians who were avid supporters of collectibles and comic books, and people that you met that collected stuff that you had a lot in common with?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, a great deal of the people were collectors, and a lot of the senators and congressmen were collectors, and I think a lot of the people, particularly, I remember vividly one incident in 1979, which was a major development in our hobby. I bought a comic for a very high price from Steve that was picked up by the press. It was a Marvel 1 for $13.5. I think if you go back to the Overstreet price guide number 10, he doesn't mention Steve or I, but he mentions this sale because what happened was the Washington Post picked it up and did a tremendous article in the major section of the Post, and then the paper started picking it up all across the country, and I was interviewed in the Los Angeles Times. They put it on the front page of the paper, and then one of the most popular TV shows at the time was called Evening Magazine, and they did about a 20-minute segment on the purchase of this comic and comics in general, and it ran in 160 cities for almost a year. And if you go back from 1976, 77 to about 1982, 83, the major portions of some of these pedigree collections were found during that period. And if we hadn't had a lot of promotion that kind of started with that particular sale and kind of evolved from that, a lot of those books probably wouldn't have sold. But we got so much press from 79 on to 82, 83 about collecting comics in general, that it really helped bring in a lot of collectors who picked up the slack when all these collections came out. So if you go back to 79, when the stock market was tanking and you were in line for gas, and there was a lot of problems with housing, and all of a sudden this new collectible field of collecting pop art and things of that nature, it kind of really started the big promotion. That was kind of the kickoff, and we got a tremendous amount of press. I couldn't believe that whole year of '79 after that happened. If you look at Bob's little market report back then, I kind of vaguely remember him mentioning they got so many calls, and his price guide started selling at a much higher rate from during the '80s. So when you look at the population report on the price guides from that period, the sales were dramatic, and they jumped up. So we had everything was perfectly timed. We had these collections coming out, the interest in pop culture, the whole concept of collecting comics, everything sort of like really took off there in '78, '79, and kind of really moved heavily in a positive direction in the '80s, which sets the tone for where we are today.
Yeah, it is very interesting to see how collectibles and the public's interest in them has evolved and has, I guess it goes in kind of cycles, but you know what the strange. Go ahead.
You have to understand, in 1979, there were only 4 books that had a value over $5,000.
Yeah.
So so to pay $13,500, I think, which was the price, was really unheard of for anything like that. And so I think people really started paying attention, and these collections came out. So you really had, if you look at the price guides from 1980 to 1990, you'll see these record prices being paid. Well, you couldn't have had that happen pre-1975 because the books were in collections of people that owned them, and they were in the attics and the basements, so they hadn't come out.
Interesting.
So if you look at the Cosmic Airplane collection, or you look at the Allentown, or you look at the Mile High collection, or the Larson collection, none of those collections have been found yet. And so it just was a perfect timing for that material to come out, and it almost seems like this was all meant to be.
Very interesting. Yeah, that's good points. Very good points. Now, what do you think in terms of, we don't have a lot of time left, but I want to hit this because it's kind of important. I think a lot of people would enjoy hearing your perspective on it. What collectibles do you think are almost there? They're starting to really mature. That you would say, hey, get in on the ground floor. Here's something you can buy that's could probably double, triple, quadruple in the next 5-10 years. And obviously, you can't guarantee anything. But what do you think is out there that is highly?
Well, there's several that come to mind, but 3 or 4 categories. First off, comic books. Comic books. When you look at the pop, and a lot of people don't do this. This is sad that they don't do a little investigating. But when you look at CGC's population reports, and you look at Marvel 1, for instance, I think there's a total of 38 books that have been graded. If you look at Action 1, there's 35 books that have been graded. If you look at Detective 27, there's 33 books that have been graded. Even Superman 1, which we always used to think there was thousands of them, there's only 66 that's been graded. And Whiz, which has always been, in my opinion, a very undervalued book, there's only 26 graded. Now, when you take away all the restored books and you try to find the books graded 8.5 or up, there's just a handful of all these titles that exist. So they're all undervalued, in my opinion, even though they're priced high in terms of what we think is a lot of money. They're very undervalued. When you look at the advertising related to movies, whether they're giveaway programs or the inserts or the posters or whatever, a lot of that is incredibly rare, and there's more and more people interested in that every day. So if you like sci-fi, Forbidden Planet one sheet, The Day the Earth Stood Still one sheet, all those kind of things, The Creature from the Black Lagoon, they all really look terribly undervalued. You go over into the whole field of art, original art. You have to remember there's only one of each of these things. So when you're looking at these great artists, whether it's Steve Ditko or Jack Kirby or Frazetta, Winsor McKay, Harriman, all of these wonderful artists, and you think you can actually own a piece of their original art, and you look at the values, they just don't correlate with what they should be worth, in my opinion. So, for instance, if you look at Frazetta, who did these wonderful Ghost Rider covers, I mean, those covers look to me they should be priceless. If you go over here and look at Winsor McKay, a Little Nemo page, and you just wonder, how is that so cheap, So, and you look at a lot of the Silver Age covers, and a lot of the Silver Age art, even though it's bringing some great prices, it's still terribly undervalued. So if you look at those, the category of advertising, with all this wonderful posters and inserts, and you look at all this memorabilia related to the club kits and these wonderful radio premiums, and all the hardware, which they referred to as bracelets and rings and badges and all these kind of things that were giveaways in the comic books. When you look at all of that merchandise and you look at the value, and you look at the value of the dollar, you see clearly that it's just too rare for what small amount of money it's bringing. And you got to remember, the United States is going to print 9 billion notes in the next 12 months in 2 different locations. They work 5 days a week, 3 8-hour shifts, and they're printing that money. And they're going to keep adding that money every year. And I say 9 billion notes. That could be a $100 bill or a $50 bill. But that money is going to continue to be made. It's backed up. It's not backed up by silver or gold anymore. But these collectibles are not being made. And these fresh finds are not turning up. And there may still be stuff out there. Who would ever say there wouldn't be? But they're not out there like they used to be. So we're starting to get a feel, even though these population reports in CGC are not totally accurate because there's still books out there that haven't been graded. But even if you double the amount, say the 35 Action 1s are now 70, it's still a small amount, particularly when there's only 2 or 3 that are 9.0 or better. So you feel comfortable that the product is not being made. You feel comfortable that a lot of it's been found, and all of a sudden you're starting to feel a lot better about your investment. So I really like art. I really like the advertising related to the media, and I really like comic books. I really think all of these things are terribly undervalued.
On the flip side of that, which collectibles do you think are either overvalued right now, or let's just say have matured to a point where there really aren't any great buys, and you see the market staying kind of stable?
Well, you have to understand, again, it's so hard to generalize about any of this because it has so many pockets of resistance, and you have to know things. But the real thing you can't go wrong on, which is really undervalued, is condition. If you look at all the categories, whether it's wind-up toys or cast iron banks, or it's paper items, or it's figurines, whatever it is, when you get these items in condition, particularly old items, they are so rare that all you got to do is just use the supply and demand concept, and there's more and more people coming into this. You have to understand, Scoop alone, we have 200, and last numbers I got was like 277,000 unique visitors. I mean, that thing is growing at such leaps and bounds. I don't know what the limitation is. I don't know how many people, there are out there. But we're talking about popular culture, the culture of the population. The average person out there is fascinated with this stuff, and the more discretionary income that's available, and the more we keep promoting to the young people, and the young people keep embracing this. We just had a $7.7 million auction in cast iron banks. Most of these banks were made between 1880 and 1890, 1900. So everybody that was buying those was not a kid back in that era. So you see clearly by some evidence like that people are collecting things that weren't necessarily made in their era, which gives it a historical concept, and as a result of that, it reinforces the fact that more and more people are liking things from other eras. And so as a result of that, it bodes well for our hobby all across the line, particularly because of the rarity. So I don't really see anything that really looks to me overpriced, and especially when you look at the value of the dollar. I mean, you have to understand the dollar is a commodity. It trades with other currencies now, and it's just like pork bellies or Swiss francs or whatever. It goes up and down in value, so it's not a stable currency like it was, say, in pre-33 when it was backed up by gold, and pre-65 when it was backed up by silver. So now it kind of runs based on what a person thinks it's worth. It could be dropping 10% value tomorrow. It could go up 10%. So you got to remember the dollar is not a barometer anymore of value that's stable. So you have to be very careful to understand that if you're going to accumulate dollars in the bank, you can wake up and be very shocked that it's been devalued and it's worth half what it was, and a lot of people are finding that out. So most people today are trying to find a place to put their money because obviously money was not made, particularly under this system, it's not made to keep. It's made to spend and buy things with. So I see, what I really see, Vinny, that's so important in all of this is the people in general under so much stress on the day-to-day living that they are desperately trying to find a place to go to enjoy themselves. And they love this hobby. They love the trade shows. They love that's why they read Scoop. People are out there collecting. They love to own their own thing and have it in their home and embrace it and enjoy it. And when it has a historical connotation and it's educational and they can bring their family involved and get them involved, get their kids, get their other members of the family interested in it, then all of a sudden it becomes a bigger thing than just a self-gratification of owning something that no one else has. And I think that's what we got going for us. There's a lot of factors in play that really help this to move ahead. And again, there's more books coming out. People are understanding it better, and they love it.
John, you make so many great points. I can't thank you enough for being on the show today. It was truly a pleasure. We actually ran over time, but it was great. I learned so much today. It was fun.
Okay.
Great having you on. I wish you the best with the museum and the new office space over in Pennsylvania, and I hope I get to see you sometime soon, and all my best to you and your family over the holidays. And thank you very much for coming on the show.
Okay. Thank you.
Take care, John.